is up, Bitcoiners? Can you believe that there is a BitcoinTina on Bitcoin podcast feed with the first 4 parts of the legendary series immortalized on their own podcast feed? If you are a new listener tuning in to BitcoinTina on Bitcoin, make sure to go back, start at episode number 1, and listen to the first 4 episodes so that way you can understand how BitcoinTina views the Bitcoin market. This is part number 5, titled The Hardest Trade. The hardest trade is about how BitcoinTina sees the Bitcoin market moving forward differently than previous bull markets. The cornerstone of his thesis of why Bitcoin will trade differently this time is because the market is different this time. Bitcoin is no longer an illegitimate asset. BitcoinTina outlines 2 other scenarios outside of the huge blow off top and then crash that is a deep consensus within the Bitcoin community. In this podcast, we're going to outline his thinking around all 3 of these scenarios of how he sees Bitcoin trading in the next few years. And we are going to talk about some really bullish scenario, guys. So this is a must listen. And to be honest, if you trade this wrong, if you're a Bitcoiner trying to sell the top in 2021, you could get wrecked. So you're going to want to listen to this one more than once. So that's for sure. This podcast is brought to you by BitcoinMagazine.com. Bitcoin Magazine is the oldest publication about Bitcoin, and we are the hub for the Bitcoin culture. We put on the biggest Bitcoin conference. Now it's the Bitcoin 2021 conference in Los Angeles. Bitcoin Magazine every single day is putting out thought leadership, amazing op-eds, awesome podcasts like this one, awesome how-to videos. We have been doing Bitcoin for a long time, and we will continue doing Bitcoin for a long time. That is it from me. That is it about Bitcoin Magazine. Like I said, this is part number 5, the hardest trade with BitcoinTina, as he explains how the Bitcoin phenomenon is going to be playing out. This is BitcoinTina on Bitcoin. What is up, Bitcoiners? I am super excited to bring a podcast that is a long time coming. This is another podcast between me and BitcoinTina where we try to distill his ever-changing and evolving mental model for the Bitcoin phenomenon. BitcoinTina, how is it going? Welcome to the show.
Hey, CK. It's going fantastic. I mean, Bitcoin's at $28,000 right now, $28,225 as we speak. It was a lot lower.
How much was it when we first recorded?
A lot lower.
It was like 7,000 or something like that.
What's that?
It was like $7,000 or something like that.
That sounds about right. It was a lot lower. And I think when many people listen to this, it's going to be a lot higher. I think the numbers are going to be insane. And it's going to be very hard for people to jump on board. Fortunately, some of them are going to have to do that.
You put out a tweet where you outlined 3 different potential, trading directions that Bitcoin could go in the short to medium term. This got a lot of attention. I think it really challenged people's mental perception of the, what's going to go down in the next few years regarding Bitcoin's price. Can you, walk through, this tweet that you put out and why you think that the deep consensus around how Bitcoin's price is going to act in 2021 may not be correct?
Most people who've been around Bitcoin for the last 11 years have learned that the way Bitcoin has traded since then has been to move up in a parabola and then crash. And so people who've been around Bitcoin for a while are pretty certain that they know how Bitcoin's going to trade because they've seen it trade this way already several times. I forget if it's 4 or 5 times. It actually could be more than that. And I call this a deep consensus. Most Bitcoiners think that people will panic at the top and sell like crazy. And I'm not so sure that's going to play out the same way this time, because I think the environment for Bitcoin is different in many ways. There's a great book written in 1923 by supposedly a nom de plume for Jesse Livermore, who was a phenomenally successful trader investor back in that period. There's a long section which we're going to include in this podcast that I'd strongly recommend people read. It's a couple of pages long. This is like the last part of it, and I'm going to read it here. And right here, let me say one thing. After spending many years in Wall Street and making and losing millions of dollars, I want to tell you this. It was never my thinking that made the big money for me. It was always my sitting. Got that? My sitting tight. It's no trick at all to be right on a market. You always find lots of early bulls in bull markets and early bears in bear markets. I've known many men who were right at exactly the right time and began buying or selling stocks when prices were at the very level which should show them the greatest profit. And their experience invariably matched mine. That is, they made no real money out of it. Men who can be both right and sit tight are uncommon. I found it one of the hardest things to learn. But it's only after a stock operator has firmly grasped this that he can make big money. It is literally true that millions come easier to a trader after he knows how to trade than hundreds did in the days of his ignorance.
That was a very powerful passage right there. I think the message is pretty clear too.
Oh, it totally is. A friend of mine told me a story about a week ago about a woman, a friend of his that he knew. She had 3 Bitcoins. And she was trading with it because she wanted to make more. And she lost them all back in March when Bitcoin crashed. It's so easy to turn yourself inside out and upside down trading. And it's so hard to sit. I think we're in a very long run secular bull market. The secular means it's just a really big bull market, big long run. I think it's going to be multiple decades with cycles in between. But I think this decade may turn out to be very different from prior decades, or last decade. And I think the reason for that is that there are different players in, and there's also a big thing happening. First, I'm going to describe the 3 different ways that I think this can go, and then I'm going to discuss my thoughts about it. So the first was parabolic up and then a crash, which is what I think most Bitcoiners think. Second, we could possibly go up 2 to 5 times in 2021, then again in 2022, then again in 2023, with intermittent corrections of 20 to 40%. And then people try to front run 2024. And I think there's a reasonably good chance of this. Finally, there is also a really good chance, in my opinion, of a massive repricing of Bitcoin in the course of the next year or two, 2021, 2022, where we hit really crazy numbers. Really crazy numbers. I'm talking about $500,000 to $1 million of Bitcoin. The interesting thing about this is this, in my opinion, is the hardest trade. When I posted this tweet, there was some guy who commented they thought number 1 was the hardest trade. And for some people, number 1 might be the hardest trade. But the people coming into this market are traders. They're Wall Street people. They might not have such a big problem peeling some off and then buying lower. Plenty of Bitcoiners are mentally prepared for the idea of a parabolic up with a crash. Number 2, going up 2 to 5 times a year for 3 years is a relatively easy thing to do. And that's a real possibility. You got people who are constantly trying to time tops, they sell, they come back, they have to buy back. The market doesn't go their way, with occasional punctuated by corrections. And I think there's a really, really good chance of that happening. That might be the most likely situation. Number 3 is actually the hardest trade. Number 3, the trade where you have a massive repricing, as I said, of $500,000 to $1 million, and then going sideways for a few years. Why is that the hardest trade? It's because so many people think you're going to get a market top. They're going to be looking for that market top, and they're going to be looking to sell that market top, hoping to buy back at much lower prices. If you pay taxes, I'm in the United States, and not everybody has the same tax regime. So this is global, and I understand that. But many people do pay taxes on assets they buy. And certainly the United States is a very large market and very much influences how things trade around the world. If you pay taxes and you sell and you have a short-term gain, the tax rate in the United States is about 37%, may go up. At the federal rate, then you have state rates, which add to that. You take an automatic hickey on that. And people will try to time it They'll look to sell the top, hoping they can buy it cheaper, or buy and sell things multiple times. But an asset which pretty much goes straight up is hard to buy and hard to hold on to. And I think we're going to see enormous waves of money coming in from a lot of new investors. It's incredibly hard to FOMO an asset, particularly for people who are used to trading, used to investing. And this is the asset, this is the group of people who's coming in. And it will be very hard for them to do that, but they likely will. And they'll likely snap up any kind of pullbacks that we see because they'll prefer to buy on pullbacks. It's also hard because when an asset goes straight up like that, it's both hard to buy and hard to sell. And then if it goes sideways for a few years after that, there's no opportunity to make any real money trading because the asset now went quiet. There are at least two examples that I know of where we've seen this happen. If you look at a 30-year chart of Walmart, you see periods where Walmart went up aggressively and then went sideways for a pretty long time. I think it did it twice. Tesla has also done this. Tesla in its early years went up a lot, then went sideways for a number of years, and last year went up like 10 times. Tesla was a very hard asset for people to buy as it was going up. Now, I don't know if Tesla's going to go sideways. I don't know what Tesla's going to do. Tesla may not be done going up yet, and Tesla may crash. That's an imperfect example. The Walmart example is something that we have seen before. Tesla may do the same. But we saw that part where it went up, went sideways, and then went up again. That is just so difficult for people because it just works against our own instincts. We try to protect ourselves because we think we're going to lose money and we're nervous that we're going to lose the profits that we've made.
So jumping in here, Tina, it's actually kind of funny that we talk about Tesla in this one. And I think we talked about Tesla in episode number 2 of the original 4-part series. But talking about protecting ourselves, you discussed why you think number 3 is such a difficult trade, especially for Bitcoiners, is your own personal experience with the 2018-2019 bear market and having to endure that. And psychologically, it's difficult to go into 2021, with Bitcoin, what you presume to be a bubble and then, not take some profits.
2018, 2019, 2018 particularly was incredibly difficult. Bitcoin crashed from 20,000 high teens to the 6 or 7 range, went sideways, and then crashed again. I spent the last part of the year, about 2 years ago, Christmas time, drinking a lot of Angel's Envy bourbon to work my way through that painful process. It was a very painful process, cracking from 6 or 7,000 to 3,000. I actually didn't like the looks of the chart, but I didn't want to sell. I was reluctant to get out because I was thinking maybe it wasn't going to do what I thought it was going to do. It did. And it was painful. It was a painful 4 months. I came out of it end of March 2019, had a big run, bit of a head fake. And so I don't want to relive those markets. I don't want to do what I did. I'd like to have more than enough capital to be able to spend without thinking about what I'm doing. Look, I'm older than most of the people listening to this. And so this is very much of a concern. So this is part of what makes number 3 the hardest trade. If something just goes up and up and up, if you're up 20 or 30 or 40x in your money, you just sell as you need to sell. You don't really worry so much about the gyrations or catching the tops. But for people coming in, it's definitely going to be very difficult. But I think you're going to see wave after wave of new buyers coming in. Different types of buyers are going to have wealthy individuals, hedge funds, and it's going to expand to other types of groups. It's going to expand to pension funds. It'll expand possibly people buying for their corporate treasuries. I think that's a later phenomenon. And the higher Bitcoin goes, the more these varying types of buyers are going to come in.
So I think this is a great place to transition into why you think the consensus scenario number 1 in your tweet, parabolic move and then huge crash. This is the deep consensus. Ansel and I were talking about this on the podcast we just released today, and he definitely believes that this is going to be the consensus. This is what's going to be happening in the future. Can you talk about why you think things have really changed this time?
I think number 1 is deep consensus because of what Bitcoiners have experienced their own personal experience. But my gut tells me that this is not how things are going to play out, because I think Bitcoiners don't really understand the players coming in to the Bitcoin market. And most of them think that those players are just like themselves. And those players are nothing like the people who've been in Bitcoin for the last 10 years. When I came into Bitcoin in 2017, I've been trading in markets for 30 plus years. One of the first things I did coming into Bitcoin was I was well aware that taxes were going to be an issue. Most Bitcoiners, from what I gathered in 2017 and 2018, hadn't considered taxes at all. And some of them that had considered taxes had absurd notions about what they thought the taxes would be like. You had people who believed that like-kind exchange was going to be an acceptable way to do their taxes, or that if they kept their money in cryptocurrency, selling from Ethereum to Bitcoin and Bitcoin to Ethereum and Cardano and whatever other currency they were buying, that they could go untaxed, not recognizing that every sale transaction, at least in the United States, and I'm talking for the United States, at least every sale transaction is considered a taxable event. So you had people who I think had a very unrealistic view of how the world works. And I think that that point of view was fine for them, but wrong. And the people coming into the Bitcoin market are different. Many of them will have a lot of money. Many of them have a lot of experience trading. Many of them have a lot of experience in markets. These are not Bitcoiners who started buying in 2010, 2011, 2012, paying very little money. You had people back in the early years of Bitcoin, 2010, 2011, 2012, who might have had no more than $5,000 or $10,000. They were buying Bitcoin at $1 or $2 or $20 or $50. And they bought a fair amount of Bitcoin. Then maybe in that 2015 region, you might have had people who might have come in with more money, maybe $500,000 who bought a lot of Bitcoin. These people made a lot of money on their Bitcoin. They had a lot of Bitcoin, but that's all they had. The players coming into the market in 2020, 2021 are people who are typically, I think, older, have money, and I'm not even talking about the professional types of investors. If you get people who are aged 35 or 40 to 70 coming into Bitcoin, what are they going to do? Most of them are going to buy what I call a what the fuck position, 1%, 2%, 5%, 10%. You're going to have a lot of people who have a fair bit of money. You've got a guy who's got $5 million. He buys a 1% position. That's $50,000. That's a lot more buying power than your typical Bitcoiner that has no money. In the early years, that's what we had. Bitcoiners who didn't really have very much money. There are people who were buying, who bought, who held, and became wealthy with Bitcoin. But if you're worth $5 million, $10 million, 20, 50, $100 million, $1 billion, and you put in 1%, 2%, 5%, 10%, here's the question for you. Guy has $20 million. He puts 5% of his money in. That's $1 million, which is a lot more buying power than many younger Bitcoiners coming into the market even now. When does a person who's worth $20 million, who puts $1 million into Bitcoin, and then watches that Bitcoin go up 30x, when does he need to sell? Never. He never needs to sell. Why? Because he's $19 million that's not in Bitcoin, and he can live on that. He doesn't have to sell his Bitcoin. Will he trim his Bitcoin? Probably yes. Traders, will they actively sell it and sell all of it and regret it? Probably yes. But when do they have to sell? They never have to sell. What has been the experience of somebody, now I'm going to speak for myself, but I think there are a lot of people that fall into this category. What's the experience of people who have been watching the markets at least since the year 2000? They watched companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Netflix, Microsoft. They've watched these companies go up, go up, go up, and go up. And most of these people, aged 35, 40 to 60, 70, most of them missed all of that. Some of them caught a little piece of it. Most of them didn't hold on. Some of them held on. They've seen that. They've experienced that. And there'll be enough of them who realize that they'd like to not miss that again. And there will be some who start to understand and realize that Bitcoin is that, except it's going to be bigger. Not everybody will understand this, but we're going to have waves and waves of money coming in. Because the big picture is this about Bitcoin, and this is what's kind of interesting to me, is Bitcoin is moving from being an illegitimate asset to becoming a must-own asset. The more people and more types of institutions and individuals that own it, the more acceptable the asset becomes. What do most people do? Most people buy when something becomes safe. When does it become safe? When everybody owns it and it goes up in price. Isn't that perverse? But that's how it works. That's how people are. That's how people think. And so you're going to have people who come in, they're going to buy 1%, 5%, 10%, and it's going to go up. Some of them will sell it all, and then they'll watch it go up more, and then they'll regret it. Some of them will peel off some. And you're going to have this situation where people are constantly coming back and having to rebuy back their positions because they're going to keep watching this thing go up. There'll be some who will watch those moves. They might sell a little bit at some peak. Maybe it comes in, but they'll look to add to their position because this asset is going from illegitimate to a must-own asset. And this is going to be the tenor of the discussion that's happening. Everybody recognizes there are all those people that are going to say, well, the government's going to ban it. The government's going to do this. The government's going to do that. But we're working our way through this process. And the more people that own it, the more companies that own it, the more investors that own it, the less likely these things happen because, as some have said, their lawyers are going to call up the lobbyists, going to call up the politicians and tell them, don't mess with my Bitcoin. The social layer.
I was speaking to Lynn Alden about this exact topic, and she was saying that in her perspective, the bigger Bitcoin gets, the more unlikely it is that it'll get banned just because there's a lot more powerful stakeholders behind it.
And I believe this is true, and I've been saying this for a long time, and Lynn has said it, Michael Saylor has said it, and I'm sure other people have said it as well. And I think this is what's going to happen as Bitcoin gets bigger. Remember, its social layer is what tends to make it anti-fragile. And this is not always well understood. So I think the character of the people buying Bitcoin and adding to Bitcoin is such that we're going to see just wave after wave of buying, because the bigger it gets, the more viable it becomes for various types of investors. There are investors who simply can't buy it at a $500 billion market cap. At a $5 or $10 trillion market cap, more types of investors can buy it. The more liquid Bitcoin becomes, the more big buyers can come in, because when they buy, they don't push the price. And this really matters. And so there is this unfolding. And I think there's an old saying, and I keep repeating this to people. And the old saying is this: once you think you found the keys to the market, they change the locks. I've said this and I keep saying it over and over and over again. And I think it's not really, I don't think Bitcoiners are hearing it and they're not understanding it. And too many people think they know. And I'm not saying that I know, because I don't know. I have no idea how this market is going to progress. But what's important, and my message to everybody listening, is you don't know either. And so number one could be right. Absolutely, number one could be right. And Bitcoin could go exactly as it has gone in the last 10 years or so. And it may, but it also could go differently. It could go like number two, where it just goes kind of straight up year after year after year, not at an extraordinary amount, but at what Bitcoiners would consider to be a decent amount, but not typical of what people think of as being Bitcoin, where it goes up 20x in a year, but 2 to 5x in a year, and then the next year and the year after that. And those become incredibly large numbers. Or finally, the hardest trade, where it just goes up a staggering amount over the course of a year or two and then goes sideways for a period of time as people try to get into this asset, which is, I think, a real possibility. And I don't know how to put odds on any of this. So if you're going to ask me what odds would you put on it, I have no idea what odds to put on it. But if you think you know how this is going to be, you don't. I don't either. Nobody does. We can only guess. But if you don't understand the factors that are going to drive this, then you have no idea, and you have no ability to even begin to understand how this is going to play out. And I think, as I said, somebody who had no money, who bought a fair bit of Bitcoin and got rich with only Bitcoin, was in a position where they had to sell. And then you had those tax issues where a lot of people didn't even understand that they had liquidity issues to deal with because they had to pay their taxes. So you had a lot of people who had to pull money out of the market in that 2018 timeframe. I met people. I met one man. I was sitting having lunch or dinner. I was talking to this woman. She was talking about her son. Her son was panicked, absolutely panicked, because of the Internal Revenue Service. He did his taxes and he didn't realize he had these enormous taxes to pay. Why? Because he bought and he sold and he bought and he sold and he bought and he sold. and he thought he had no taxes to pay, and he wasn't prepared for it. And he had to sell a lot of what he owned to pay these taxes. So I think there was a massive liquidity event that happened in Bitcoin in 2018, where people had to sell just to pay taxes, and they sold in a declining market to pay taxes, which really compounded the problem substantially and made for a fairly bad bear market. People coming into the market now, they know all about taxes. They've been doing and paying their taxes for years and years and years, just like me. I came into Bitcoin knowing and understanding that I was going to have to deal with my taxes, and had already decided that one of the best ways of dealing with my taxes is not selling. So I don't have to pay taxes because I didn't sell. I did do some selling in 2017, 2018, and I took care of my taxes on those things that I sold. Made money in 2017, lost money in 2018. But that was that. And that was in the early years when I still had some shitcoins. But I sold all of those and went only into Bitcoin. It wasn't a very high percentage. It matters who these people are that are coming in. And I think it matters the context of the climate and the environment of what's happening, and how meaningful that is, that as Bitcoin changes, the perception of Bitcoin changes. I always thought Bitcoin was a legitimate asset, and I'm guessing many Bitcoiners did too. But even amongst Bitcoiners, there are many Bitcoiners who I don't think fully understood how valuable this asset was in the early years. And some of them did, and some of them were very astute. Many of them didn't, and didn't really comprehend what this thing was worth. So we hear this all the time. And I think many of the people coming in now, they don't understand either. They really don't get it. Many on Wall Street do not really understand what Bitcoin is. Many of them think of it as just another asset to trade. And so they're going to temper the price to an extent, which is a good thing. That's not a bad thing, which leads to scenario two, because you're going to have people who sell, who provide supply. And so maybe that keeps Bitcoin from going up as much and tempers it, and keeps the likelihood of the parabola down. So you don't have that same parabolic up move. But as new money comes in, that will provide a lot of buying. And that lends towards the number two style market, where it goes up a very nice amount, outperforms most other assets, which means it's going to attract more and more capital. If Bitcoin is far and away the best performing asset, people will flock to it, particularly as it is seen as an asset which is a must-own asset. And so in the process of this decade, in the process of the next few years, I think you'll see people start off with a small position because they're scared of it. They're somewhat tepid about it, put in that 1%, 2%, 5% position. And maybe they trim, but they'll be quick to add to their position later on. There'll be many people who own gold and Bitcoin, who dump their gold, get rid of it, and use that as a source of funds for buying more Bitcoin. There's going to be a lot of people who start to see things much in the way I see them, and will be adding. And I think you're going to see position sizes grow quite substantially in Bitcoin. Michael Saylor has said, and I agree with him, that if you understand Bitcoin, you can't own a 1% position. It's absurd. You're going to have a fairly large position. And I think more and more people will come to understand this. Stocks are not a good store of value. Stocks are businesses. And there are people out there basically making this argument and not fully understanding that they have to be in Bitcoin, and making arguments against Bitcoin and being reluctant to really hold Bitcoin and understand. I find it actually shocking that people are making these arguments about concerns about indexation and passive investing, which is basically saying exactly what I'm saying. That's attributing store of value to these things. So when you buy an S&P index, you're treating stocks as if they're store of value, and that creates a lot of problems. And it should be obvious, in my opinion, that if you see it that way, then something like Bitcoin becomes the only answer.
BitcoinTina, right? What does TINA stand for?
There is no alternative, and there is no alternative. Your choice is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just so difficult for people to understand. Bitcoin gives people financially such an unfair advantage owning it that you have to own it. And when you begin to understand this, you want to own as much as you're able to own. Michael Saylor has described it as taking the high ground. In Bitcoin, we're on the high ground. And this is not a discussion about Bitcoin. So I can spend hours talking about that. It's just thinking about how the next few years might progress. And as I said, don't think you know because you don't. I don't think I know. I think I'm open to the possibility of there being several different potential ways this goes. although I lean towards 2 and 3 as being the likely outcomes, with the possibility that number 3 is the way things work out, because 3 is the hardest trade. And often markets do what's hardest. They impose the most amount of pain. And for many people, going up very aggressively and then going sideways will be the most amount of pain, because people will be reluctant to get in. It'll finally peak out, it'll go sideways, and that's when people will buy. Except this time, I don't think you're going to see it crash. I just think it'll continue to go sideways in a big range. Make up numbers. If it went to $1 million, maybe it trades in a range of 800,000 to $1 million, which is not a huge range on a percentage basis. So I think that's pretty much it, unless you think I've missed something, CK?
No, I feel like this is a great time for your last word. So I know there's a few people that you wanted to recommend and shout out to the audience.
I really feel very strongly about people doing more work and understanding Bitcoin. One guy who I really love to show his name is Parker Lewis. He has written some absolutely wonderful, wonderful pieces. Parker works at Unchained Capital. He's written a piece which I think is an absolutely essential piece to read. All Bitcoiners should read this. All Bitcoiners should give this to pre-coiners. Bitcoin is the great definancialization. This is a fabulous piece. I believe Guy Swan from Bitcoin Audible has done a read on this. For those of you who are lazy like me and prefer to listen rather than read, I just can't recommend this highly enough. It's a fabulous, fabulous piece. Read it or listen to it or do both. Also, you should read all of Parker's pieces. His pieces are phenomenal. They're very important. They give a strong intellectual grounding and framework for understanding Bitcoin. Pre-coiners should read it, particularly those who are more sophisticated. I can't recommend it highly enough. I really want people to read and understand this. It's really critical.
Guy Swan of Bitcoin Audible has also read every single Parker Lewis piece. So just find Bitcoin Audible, and then in your podcast app, you can search for Parker Lewis, and you will find all of them there in Audible form.
Second show, Robert Breedlove and Michael Saylor have produced a 7-part series. It may be longer. Part 7 dropped today. Absolutely phenomenal series. Michael has phenomenal insights. He goes through much history of humanity. We get an insight into the way Michael sees the world. I found it absolutely wonderful. I mean, it was just absolutely wonderful. I can't recommend that highly enough. I enjoyed it tremendously. Listening, it's like Michael takes you through a graduate level course in understanding Bitcoin, the why of Bitcoin. And he talks about so many different topics. Listen to all of it. Start with the beginning. The first several parts, the first several episodes are not specifically about Bitcoin, but he lays a foundation. I tweeted a tweet today from Karate Kid. And for those of you who remember, that scene, wax on, wax off, paint the house, sand the floor. And Mr. Miyagi taught Daniel-san karate by starting him off with those foundations. Michael Saylor does something similar. He takes us through an overview of human history. And that's really integral in understanding so many aspects of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is more than just money. It's more than just a technological phenomena. And when you listen to Michael, you begin to understand how deep this will reach into humanity and why Bitcoin will be so incredibly powerful. It's an absolutely must listen. And many of the things that I would have loved to have said today, but didn't really want to take the time to do it, Michael talks about. And he says many things that I'm in complete agreement with, things that I've been saying for a very, very long time now. And I love the way Michael says it. I cannot speak highly enough. Please, if you're a Bitcoiner, listen to it. If you know pre-coiners, please get them to listen to it. It is so helpful in understanding Bitcoin. And I know many people will not take the time. They'll think it's not important. It's not worth it to them. It's going to mean so much to them financially in understanding this. And he does such a phenomenal job. Okay, last show. Samson Mao and Preston Pish did a wonderful podcast. I don't remember the number of the podcast. Samson discussed a lot of some of the things happening in the Bitcoin ecosystem. One of my pet peeves is not nearly enough Bitcoiners really have an understanding of what's happening in the Bitcoin ecosystem, how broad it is, how deep it is. how the Bitcoin ecosystem will simply destroy all these altcoins, all these shitcoins. There's not one that's worth a thing. I wouldn't put 10 cents into any of them.
Thank you so much for coming on to the show. And honestly, I feel like every time we do one of these podcasts, it is to help people better understand this Bitcoin phenomenon, right? Like we're not just chatting when we record. This is to help you align your mental model with reality. And truly, the deep consensus is scenario number one. But if Tina is right about scenario number one not being accurate for this time around, there can be a lot of pain. I know there's a lot of Bitcoiners who are planning to exit the top in 2021. And I mean, absolutely, they're make life-changing money, right? But be aware that you might never get those Bitcoins back.
You're going to pay taxes on them. And if after a little correction, the market keeps going higher, you're going to own a lot less Bitcoin. And unfortunately, that's going to be the fate of a lot of Bitcoiners. It's hard.
Tina, thank you so much again. To all the listeners, I want you guys, if you're listening to this, you are on the brand new BitcoinTina on Bitcoin podcast feed. You can also go and listen to part 1 through 4. I would recommend doing it in order of the original BitcoinTina on Bitcoin podcast series from last year. So before the COVID pandemic, before the craziness of 2020 played out, BitcoinTina was explaining his mental model, which has proven to be prophetic in hindsight. I actually just listened to it last week in preparation for this recording. So, I mean, I could not recommend it enough. I'm so excited to be highlighting the first 4 parts and adding to them with this excellent piece to add onto this series. So I'm not sure if we will do more, but I just think, with these 5 episodes, it's going to help a lot of Bitcoiners, pre-coiners, no-coiners better understand the most important phenomenon that's happening in the world today.
Thanks, CK.
All right, everyone, make sure to follow Bitcoin Magazine. Make sure to follow BitcoinTina at BitcoinTina, and you can follow me at CK_snarks. Peace. A quick reminder that all of the content in this episode is for informational and entertainment purposes only. You should not construe the information as legal, tax, investment, financial, or any other advice. Nothing contained in this presentation constitutes a solicitation, recommendation, or offer by BTC Media, the Let's Talk Bitcoin podcast network, or any third-party service provider to buy or sell securities or any other financial instruments. Do your own research.